The time has come for the Cobra to rise up and reveal himself.
Welcome back, my quiver of capitalists, to AP Economics, presented by Cobranomics, your all-American American history teacher, gold standard of economics, le champion of classical liberalism, and sensei of supply side, Professor G here. And today we are going to take a look at Unit 6, Lesson 3, the Phillips curve. And to give you some historical circumstance, A.W. Phillips writes this thesis in 1958. This is 10 years after the passing of our founder, the Baron John Maynard Keynes, and he is writing this to show, after decades of studying the British economics, he is writing this to show the dangers of just using Keynesian economics wantonly out of the context of what Keynes is saying, to use it to kickstart an economy and then withdraw the fiscal policy and government spending. Because by this time, 10 years later, you have this movement of pseudo-Keynesians, people saying they are Keynesians, saying things in the name of Keynes, but taking our founder's name in vain and just advocating things like full employment policies regardless of inflationary repercussions. And Phillips is writing as a response to say, like, no, that fiscal and monetary policy, especially fiscal policy, is a trade-off. To go to a couple of adages, you can't have your cake and eat it too, and you can't have it both ways. That if you are trying to solve one problem, you are going to create another problem. And so the Phillips curve, named after himself, we're going to take a look at two Phillips curves, the short-run Phillips curve and the long-run Phillips curve. But we're going to start first with our basic short-run Phillips curve, whose goal is to show, one, that inflation and unemployment are trade-offs, especially when you use fiscal or monetary policy to solve it. And we'll put the two together, fiscal and monetary policy, because we've seen from previous units that you really have to use the two together. And if you don't, then you're going to have the crowding out effect. And we're also going to see, exactly from our last lesson, how this curve can illustrate the dangers of inflationary expectation and rational expectations. So the Phillips curve, its main purpose is the visualization of the dangers of the side effects of fiscal policy. And we also have our old full employment graph up here, our basic aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph up here, because the Phillips curve is just putting a different twist on it. If we take a look at the axes of the short-run Phillips curve, the short-run Phillips curve is essentially the aggregate demand curve, but for just slightly different but very important parameters. We still have price level and inflation rate, essentially the same thing. And instead of real GDP, we have the unemployment rate. And the short-run Phillips curve really represents, very similar to aggregate demand, short-run output. Short-run, people working, people spending, things produced because of the newly spent items. So, let's take a look. For the short-run Phillips curve, let's say we have unemployment, and we're also going to come back to the specific shape of the Phillips curve. Notice that your aggregate supply, aggregate demand are perfectly horizontal lines, whereas the Phillips curve is more like kind of this bent L, and that is done for a reason. So let's say we have high unemployment, and based on our axis, here we have 0 and upwards. Let's say this is like 6%. And if there is high unemployment, we know from our full employment graph that if aggregate demand is low, price level is also going to be low, because if people are not spending money, that means there is less money going through the circular flow model, or a negative amount going through the circular flow model, which means businesses are laying people off. which means you have even less spending in an economy. And if there's less spending, prices are going to drop. So we also have low prices. So less spending so we see here right away, less spending and high unemployment go together. And if we have the situation, John Maynard Keynes would recommend an expansionary fiscal policy where you would have an increase in government spending, and that increase in government spending would have a multiplied effect on consumer spending, and thus a multiplied total real GDP. So we would have a shift to the right in aggregate demand, and as people are spending more money, we see an increase in real GDP and total output. As more people are hired to make more products, you need more labor to make more products to meet that demand. And as people are willing and able to spend more, price level will also increase. So how can we show this change in our classic full employment graph on a W. Phillips graph? So here we see an increase in aggregate demand is a shift to the right, raising output and raising prices. But remember, output and unemployment move in opposite directions. As people are spending more and we are producing more, unemployment decreases. So a shift to the right of the aggregate demand curve is actually a movement to the left along the SRPC. So if this was A, then this fiscal policy action here would be letter B over here. And we see that it actually matches pretty perfectly. We are going to have a decrease in unemployment caused by that increase in output. So let's say unemployment drops to where it should be. But as people are spending more, you have this increase in aggregate demand driving up prices. And here on the Phillips curve, we see that trade-off more specifically. That is, the government combats unemployment. They are generating additional spending, which is driving up prices. So you see an increase in prices. And again, the numbers I'm choosing are just kind of arbitrary based on the axes. And now here's where Phillips's L-shaped curve comes in. This is to show that a government cannot keep throwing money at an economy because of the trade-off. And in fact, that trade-off, the costs increase as they throw more money at a problem. Because if we take a look at this curve, let's say the government wanted to spend even more money. And the government's spending more money, but it's not really moving the needle on unemployment. Right? Unemployment is slowly decreasing because at a certain point, there's only so much unemployment you can get rid of. There is frictional and structural unemployment that is always going to be there. However, what is the government doing? It is flooding the money with billions, if not trillions, of dollars. And remember, if it's fiscal and monetary policy working together, that is a lot of spending and increase in money supply flooding the economy. And Phillips is showing that, yeah, this is fine to kickstart an economy in the right direction, but as you keep spending money, the effect on unemployment isn't as noticeable, but what is noticeable is that prices are going to keep climbing up and up and up. So that full employment policies, regardless of inflation, are not something a government should do. And Phillips is warning against this in his short-run Phillips curve, that you just cannot keep throwing money at a problem. It's only going to create worse inflation. Let's take a quick look at the opposite. Let's take a quick look at a contractionary policy now. So now let's take a look at, let's say a country is suffering from inflation. So here, let's start us up here. Let's make this point A now. So if a country is suffering from inflation, we know that price level is going to be high. Let's say 5% here. But if it's your basic demand pull inflationary gap, unemployment should be low because we are producing beyond where we should be. And we're leaving LRAS out of this graph just to show you the correspondence between specifically AD and SRPC, not throwing in all these other curves, right? So the goal of not having the LRAS here is to really just focus on AD and SRPC as basically siblings. And here we have unemployment, and unemployment would be low. But if inflation is climbing, especially let's say beyond the 2% and well beyond the 2% CPI, then the government's going to do, and the Federal Reserve will do a contractionary monetary policy to shrink aggregate demand, so to pull money out of the economy. So now let's take a look at what's going to happen from here to here. So aggregate demand decreases with a contractionary economy. Again, now we're going to trade off from inflation to unemployment. We're going to solve inflation. We're going to decrease aggregate demand, reduce spending in the economy. That reduction in spending is going to decrease output. And now we have output is decreasing. As output decreases, so we have spending is going to come down. Total spending, aggregate demand is going to decrease. And as that output decreases, you don't need the labor to produce those products that people aren't spending money on. So we're going to have a movement along the SRPC to the right, and what we have here is that inflation. We have solved inflation, but by using fiscal and monetary policy to solve inflation, we have now traded off and have caused an increase in unemployment. So again, Phillips showing that if you specifically use fiscal and demand side fiscal policy to solve inflation, you create unemployment. And before, in the first example, if you use demand side fiscal policy to solve unemployment, you are going to create inflation. You can't have your cake and eat it too with aggregate demand. Now let's take a look at how we have inflationary expectations and rational expectations. And again, we're going to use our ASAD graph. And remember, with inflationary expectations and rational expectations, this is about people are anticipating inflation, acting rationally as households, and households, knowing that the product market is going to get more expensive, are now going to collectively demand higher wages in the factor market. So rational expectations and inflationary expectations, always, if ever you see this, they are always affecting aggregate supply, because wages are the ability and willingness to produce. So, and again, this is really where Phillips is warning against that you can't just flood an economy with money.